Thank you very much, Brian and Georgia, for inviting me today. I hope, even though I'm gonna do my presentation remotely, I will still be able to bring effective contribution to the workshop. Today, I will be speaking about regulatory approaches to light pollution mitigation. Let me and my plan would be as follows. So basically, I will try in the next 20 to 25 minutes to fit a lot of stuff. I will be talking about what is going on with light pollution regulation basically in Europe. I will discuss what were the factors which facilitated the adoption of these regulations. Then I will present you the classification of these different approaches, which I developed within my doctorate research. And then I will give you examples of the action at the national level, at the European Union level, and a little bit at the international level to grasp what's going on. And then I will give some conclusions and recommendations which I found relevant with regard to, let's say, regulatory and policy approaches in the problem we're discussing today. So to start with, I made like one little map to show basically what's going on in Europe. Here you can see a very tiny map representing countries which whether have separated light pollution law, which exists there in force, and it's like something not connected to any other legislation, and also some countries which do have pretty strong light pollution regulations, which are a part of, for example, environmental law. Currently, it's only 22 countries in Europe, which is sad, but I hope I will provide you with some information that there is a movement and more and more countries started to adopt national legislation. And here the map which represents local action. And local action is very interesting. I think light pollution is the problem which actually touches different political agendas from the local level to the international level. Here's the map, which is also pretty limited, but you actually can see how many different municipalities has adopted, let's say, light pollution ordinances or dark sky ordinances. I didn't include here, for example, United States, because this would be also way more. But in Europe, we already can see that more and more local communities started to adopt certain level. I'm not saying that they're perfect, but there is already a visible movement towards light pollution reduction. Here you can see that more than 600 local municipalities have adopted these regulations. So this was the broad visual picture, and now we're going to some theoretical explanation of the situation. So what actually contributed to the adoption of light pollution laws worldwide? First of all, it was obviously energy efficiency from the energy crisis in 2022. Exactly more than 600 local governments, local communities started to adopt local regulations to address the issue of light pollution, but mainly with the focus of energy savings. So it went to either way complete switch off or some automatic light detection systems. The problem with focus of energy efficiency regulations is that we sometimes face problem with public correspondence. For example, I will give you the real example from Ghent, where I'm based. In Ghent, they adopted light pollution reduction measures from 2022, and they basically created the situation when some squares were extremely lit and then they were dark streets, and people started to complain that actually they feel scared. So we have the situation and the conflict between public safety and the feeling of safety actually, and the crime rates, which is like the objective category. But I think we should put this to the discussion rather than I will go into deep conversation now. The second factor which led to the adoption of light pollution regulations are environmental concerns. Sorry, as Kevin presented, there is a lot of research going on, and it's been a while, and we have a lot of evidence showing that artificial light at night has impacts on various species, environments, different ecological processes, as well as habitat connectivity. And a lot of national states, for example, France and Germany, they adopted legal and policy measures to protect the environment or biodiversity from light pollution impacts. And the third trigger, which led to the adoption of light pollution regulations, is actually the need to protect dark and quiet skies for astronomy. Astronomical community was always there from 1950s, advocating for this type of policies and regulations. And we can see that many local, regional, and national government bodies started to act and to protect astronomical activity specifically, and by introducing the measures to protect dark skies. And one of the biggest measures is to create the dark sky protection zone across the observatory. We have this, for example, in Canary Islands and in some parts of the world. And now the problem is growing bigger because this problem was discussed just now. Actually, they're still discussing it at the United Nations COPIUS meeting. So now we're considering astronomical activities a kind of space sustainability as well. So it's a very, light pollution basically is a very broad problem. Okay, so because there's a lot of regulations which are not only focusing on light pollution specifically, but on lighting, within my research, which I'm doing for more than 4 years now, I identified how to find this regulation. So, and what are they consisting of? So this classification includes firstly the division into legal instruments and policy instruments, which are obviously they're interconnected and interdependent, but we have to still kind of understand what are the differences. Policy instruments are, they're more flexible, they indicate the specific need, for example, to reduce artificial light levels. They can introduce the targets. They can also introduce the need to adopt future laws. But however, the problem with policy is there is no mechanism which will allow us to enforce it. For example, we can see with climate change policies. We cannot literally act on them if we don't have a supporting law. So here they come legal instruments which are adopted in specific procedures, pretty strict procedures, and these legal instruments, they can be enforced, and they normally establish an obligation to reduce light pollution levels. They can also have, for example, sanctions for non-compliance bodies who can follow this procedure. The second category of the instruments are binding, which are hard instrument, hard law, and then non-binding soft instrument or soft law. And here, the problem with light pollution, that majority of the documents are instruments are actually recommendations, which is very sad, so not binding. Non-binding instruments, they can be adopted by the various governments as well as organizations. Like I'm pretty sure Dark Sky Island developed certain guidelines and recommendation, as well as Dark Sky International and some other different communities. However, like nobody has to follow them. There is again no enforcement mechanism. And then we have binding hard law instruments, which actually impose an obligation to act, and they are adopted by empowered international or state bodies. The next instruments, like the part of categorization, which will help you to identify the specific measures, is the level. And I want to highlight here that all the levels are very important. And to really address the issue of light pollution or any other concerns, we have to act in every office level. So we have international level when light pollution is considered as transboundary concern and requires international cooperation. I will give you an example later. For example, when we see how United Nations Environmental Programme acts to address light pollution, and we already can see it. Then we have European Union action when light pollution is also considered as transboundary concern, which requires the joint action of member states, and the European Union is also moving forward with that. And then we have national and local level when light pollution is actually a concern at the national level of a specific country, and then we can have national policies and legislation on this regard. And the final very proud slide of mine, because again, there's so many different approaches to light pollution reduction, because we don't have a certain international or European Union framework which will allow us to follow certain like guidance in development of these laws. So currently, we can find light pollution mitigation measures or reduction measures in the various areas of law. Here I provided you with some examples. We're coming back to energy efficiency when we can find light pollution reduction measures for saving the energy. But again, we all know that there's a lot of problems around it. For example, if we're talking about energy efficient lighting, which can be white or blue LED, it's one of the main source of increased light pollution in the end of the day. So we shouldn't be focusing only on energy efficiency legislation or policies. Then we have urban planning. So, in urban planning documents, we indicate the amount of light per different urban zones, for example, residential or commercial. And in some countries, in most of the countries nowadays, we only have the minimum amount of light per zone, which is normally very high. And in some countries, they started to switch and putting the maximum amount of light per zone, which actually leads to the certain reduction or a certain level of control at least. Then another area is environmental protection. Here is pretty obvious. Light pollution is considered as an environmental pollutant, or artificial light at night is considered as pollutant as itself. And then we see the incorporation of light pollution in existing framework of environmental law. And Brian mentioned precaution and prevention principle. And basically, we're using what we already have without inventing a wheel, the environmental legislation to address light pollution as environmental concern. Then we have protection of astronomy and observation. As I mentioned earlier, here we have dark sky zone to protect astronomical observations. We have public procurement. I will talk about the European Green Public Procurement criteria later, but basically within the procedure of procurement, we try some countries try to minimize light emissions for future projects. Then we have protection of indigenous communities, as we all know, and Brian already mentioned it also in the presentation. We relied on the dark skies for centuries, for years, and some indigenous communities still do that. For example, in New Zealand, Australia, and then we protect dark skies for protection, actually, indigenous communities and their heritage. Then we can also talk about cultural heritage when dark sky is recognized as the common heritage of humankind, which I just completely agree with that. Then we have space sustainability regulations when dark and quiet skies are protected for the future exploration. Currently, we have the horrible situation with satellites and mega constellations, and soon we will not be able to see the sky at all, also due to increased amount of satellites and space debris. And finally, which is unique area, is that some countries, they have specific light pollution law or dark sky protection laws, which address various aspects of light pollution. For example, environmental problems, human health problems, light nuisance, and so on. So it's like pretty broad legislation. I hope it will help you to kind of find your way in this very broad and complicated laws in every country. But I would like to wrap up this classification with my final conclusion is currently there are two main ways how countries address the increased artificial light at night. It's either way they start to adopt light pollution acts, so specifically to address the problem with all the broad impacts, and then they follow with additional, for example, government acts, or they incorporate light pollution reduction measures into existing environmental framework. And I would like to give you some national examples. I don't have time to go through all of them, but here I have three examples of three countries, which is Croatia, Germany, and France, basically represent the approaches which I just mentioned. Croatia adopted a separated act on light pollution reduction. Germany changed the environmental legislation by introducing the new measures to address ALAN levels, and then France has a mixed approach. So talking about Croatia, Croatia adopted this act in 2021. The law is pretty broad. It includes different measures to reduce different forms of light pollution for protection of the environment and human health. And then they have a lot of ordinances, I think three or more they adopted, which are related to changing of the lighting plan of the country. They also developed the funding system for the local communities to facilitate these changes. And they also, Croatia is a good showcase that actually switching and reduction of light can help to enhance the protection of the environment and save money and save energy. Speaking about Germany, Germany basically amended the General Nature Conservation Act by adoption Insect Protection Act in 2022, and most of the regulations go against for protection of insects, and but I mean they basically indicated that Allen is a major driver of insect decline. There are a lot of norms specifically for insects, but also I think they can be applied broader for the whole environment and human health as well. They're beneficial. And then they basically they have the term which is a bit frustrating, which is environmentally friendly lighting bulbs, which I believe some people in the room, because I cannot see you anyway, but you will maybe agree with me that you cannot say that some of the lighting is actually environmentally friendly. So in Germany, there was a government act issued which explained what do they mean by insect-friendly lighting, and they indicated that it's controlled. So it has automatic light detection system. It's maximum 3000 Kelvin. It's not allowed to use ultraviolet. It should be directed only downwards, and we have to close luminaries. So it's very shortly. I can give you the links to analyze it in more detail. And then we have France, and France, they have Light Pollution Act, and they also amended the environmental legislation, and they also introduce they have a pretty broad regulations. They have they indicated the measures to also reduce the disturbance for the environment, human health, and to reduce energy consumption. They introduced some curfews, indicated upward light ratio, and indicated some other measures. But I think the most important is that France, in comparison with other countries, they have sanctions for non-compliance. So the regulations will be mandatory from 2025. And after that, if you didn't change your light accordance to the in accordance with the act, you can get a fine. And the local government, they also define the competence. So local government is responsible to do this check. There's also a pretty developed complaint procedure. So I believe that law in France is going to work better than in some other countries. We have some bad examples before, like in Czech Republic, because when you not define the sanctions or compliance, or competence, we have a very big problems with compliance with the law in the future. Okay, so now I will dig into the action which is currently undertaken by the European Union. So to start with, there is no currently a specific policy or law to address light pollution in the European Union, but there are a lot of different actions which are related to light pollution specifically, which is already there. First of all, it's 8 environmental action program to 2030, which indicate that we need to pursue zero pollution, and including in relation to light and noise pollution. So it's already there. And despite that there's no specific norms, they're basically addressing that we should use the existing European conservation law to reduce the impacts of light pollution. And the next is EU biodiversity strategy. Despite that the biodiversity strategy itself doesn't mention light pollution, there was an action taken by the European Parliament in 2021, and they indicated that they called Commission to include ambitious reduction targets for 2030 on the use of outdoor artificial lights at night. So, and give some guidelines and recommendations. So hopefully, maybe we will see it by then. Or then recently, they adopted Future Policy Brief in 2023, which is light pollution mitigation measures for environmental protection, which I would say it's kind of a literature review of environmental impacts together with the best practices. What's also very important, they just funded two European Union Horizon projects. I mean, I'm not talking, they're also integrated. There's a lot of basically grants going on. These two projects started in January 2024, so just now, and I'm happy to be a member of scientific coordination team of Plan B project, and we also have Aquaplan. It's two sister projects focusing on the impacts of light and noise pollution on environment and biodiversity. Plan B, so my project is focusing on terrestrial and terrestrial biodiversity and ecosystem services, while Aquaplan is focusing on marine biodiversity and ecosystem services. The main goal of both of the projects is to provide a better understanding directly to the Commission, which is really good. So I believe that we will be able to proceed with the future action of the Commission because we are developing a knowledge database and we are writing a lot of policy briefs, which will be reviewed by the Commission. And we're also planning to present this policy brief to other governments and in the conference of the parties, for example, Convention on Biological Diversity. So I believe this was a good action of European Union to fund this project specifically related kind of to policy lawmaking. Then we have nature restoration law. I know that we have a lot of problems with that, but I believe in the best and that it will be adopted. But in future nature restoration law, in preambula mentioned light pollution as well. It indicated scientific evidence suggests that artificial light negatively impact biodiversity and can also impact human health. And member states should be able to consider to stop, reduce, or remediate light pollution in all ecosystems. I mean, it's really good that it's mentioned there. I think it's a big step at the European Union level currently. Now I want to discuss another bit of it, what is going on in the European Union, and I want to bring your attention to presidencies of the European Council. I would like to start with Czech Republic presidency, which was followed by Spanish presidency, and then there is a following action. During Czech Republic presidency in 2022, light pollution has been chosen as one of the Ministry of the Environment priorities for the presidency. And they have a lot of different events, but I will just introduce you the major points. There was an international light pollution workshop in Brno, which was attended by members from more than 19 states, including representative from the Commission, Dark Sky International, European Environmental Agency, and some other professional lighting organizations. So I liked that meeting also because it wasn't only researchers or only policy makers. It was literally people with the different backgrounds and from the different countries, including the backgrounds of professional lighting industry. I think that we're always neglecting these people to get invited in a discussion of light pollution. The result of the Czech presidency was adoption of Brno Appeal to reduce light pollution in Europe. It's a kind of a policy, basically it's a policy brief, policy document, which indicates the need to reduce light pollution in Europe. It's pretty obvious by basically using already existing environmental legislation, European environmental legislation, and also to develop some policy documents by introducing new targets on light pollution reduction. And this document was passed to European Commission and was presented also in a meeting of environmental ministers, which I will discuss further. The second presidency, which also took a very, let's say, high action to reduce light pollution was Spanish presidency. Again, I will just introduce some points. There was a meeting on light pollution challenges, sorry, and responses for monitoring it in November 2023 in Granada. It was organized by Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation, and it also was attended by more than from representatives from more than 15 different member states with also different backgrounds. So this workshop, this meeting was dedicated to addressing the pressing issues surrounding light pollution and its monitoring, and the need to address its environmental and legal concerns. So the result of this meeting also was, I think, pretty valuable because the meeting was only just 2 days. We drafted manifesto for tackling light pollution and proposing EU light pollution monitoring. This document basically repeats some points which were addressed in Czech Republic Brno Appeal, but it also introduces some necessity of creating light pollution monitoring in Europe. So basically, we suggested to include light pollution as a part of environmental monitoring, which is already there. We were literally not pursuing for inventing the wheel. We're just talking about the necessity to just including light pollution into all the existing legislation, policy action, or monitoring action and measurement action. This document is open for signature. So if you're willing to sign it, to get acquainted with it, because we're planning to work with the document and also present it to European Commission and the Parliament. And then finally, I mean, hopefully the action is not going to stop there, but these two presidencies were followed up by Light Pollution Conference, which was held recently. Again, I think it was Prague in 2024. The conference was attended for more than 80 experts from various European countries to discuss light pollution control. So again, the subject is remains the same, and it was followed by ministries meeting which includes representatives from different European countries. And I wanted to quote this, that politicians noted that there is a need to change our perspective on nocturnal lighting and the need for technical standards at the European level, as well as the unified monitoring and permitting procedures in individual member states. So I believe more and more countries, more and more national governments started to understand the problem and thinking about the needed action. What I also would like to mention here that both Brno Appeal and Manifesto indicates that we have currently environmental law which basically protects only half of the environment because it's only focused on the daytime rather than the nighttime. And by neglecting the protection of nocturnal environments, we're not protecting half and we're not going to achieve all the targets which we're indicating there. Okay, now I would like to present you maybe some thoughts how I see we can use the already existing legislation. All right, one example of the biggest two directives, which is Habitat and the Bird directives, which create Natura 2000 regime. So we created Natura 2000 to allow species to migrate freely in between the different natural areas. However, in most cases, between two national parks, we have a giant road which is extremely illuminated, and there is a lot of research shows that species are being trapped in these different national parks. So Natura 2000 regime, it seeks to provide adequate conservation of ecosystem and biodiversity, among the others, avoiding the deterioration of habitats and disturbance of species. By giving you just an example of two national parks in a road, it basically shows that light is disturbance. And this is not only my opinion. This opinion was also supported by European Court of Justice. And here you can see some pictures from the decision of the European Court of Justice. The case was European Commission against Greece, Helletic Republic, and the court ruled that Greece failed to comply with Habitats Directive by not changing the street lighting on the shore side to protect the sea turtles. Here also, I don't know if the presentation is going to be shared, but I also put the link here. And I think this is a really good case to show that the existing legislation can already work against light pollution and it's supported by the court. And finally, in the European Union action framework, I would like to mention a green public procurement criteria for road lighting and traffic signals. It's the one which was reviewed in 2018, so the latest version of it. The environmental aspects covered by the green public procurement criteria are split into three broad sections, which is environmental consumption, energy consumption, apologies, light pollution, and the lifetime of lighting. I will obviously focus on light pollution. But before I will go to it, I would like to present how actually these criteria work. So we have urban roads and non-urban roads. We identify the responsible authority, and then we have to ask the question whether the road should be lit or not. And then depending on the answer, we may use the criteria. The problem with the European Green Public Procurement criteria is that it's not binding document. However, some of the countries follow it and it becomes a national standard and legislation which is binding. So it still has a pretty big role in this regard. I basically put two screenshots in my presentation from the document, which relates to light pollution. And basically, when we're talking about green public procurement and future projects, we have to think about outward light ratio and abstraction light. And they indicate the need that all luminaries models should be rated with zero upwards ratio, but at the same time, they highlight the need to follow some of the European Union standards, which in some cases are the one which contributes to light pollution creation. For example, the first standard, which related to the road lighting, because it requires the uniformity of lighting, which are high lighting bulbs and the very white lighting in most cases. But the second is more interesting one. This criteria relates to ecological light pollution and star visibility. And here they indicate the need to have like automatic light detection system or dimming systems or a complete switch off during the closing hours. They also indicate the need to not put any lighting if we talk about nature sensitive areas. And then they indicate basically the needs the brightness, the color temperature should be not higher than 3000 Kelvin. Okay, this is a very briefly, and I would like to go into the international action just to showcase that we see a bit of work going on at the local, regional, national, and also international level. As an example, I have here for you conventional migratory species, which was adopted in 1979. It is included in United Nations Environmental Programme. And this convention has adopted a number of different documents and resolutions, but all these documents, they're policy documents, they're non-binding documents. However, they're adopted in international level and they're related to specifically to environmental protection. And here I have some historical bits of the process, what was going on. The problem of light pollution was addressed in 2020 during the conference of the parties, 13th conference of the parties, when they adopted light pollution guidelines for wildlife. But these guidelines were specifically focused on three species, which are marine turtles, seabirds, and migratory shorebirds. And then there was a lot of work being done, and these guidelines were expanded. And the first draft of the newer guidelines, which are broader, were presented in 2022. And then the remarkable, I think, was the 14th conference of the parties, 2024, which marked the launching of the first ever State of World's Migratory Species report. And this report, I will not go deep into that, but it mentioned light pollution 27 times. So we basically can see that the international community and some major environmental protection conventions are highlighting the need to address the problem. So what is the role of CMS? It's recognized ALAN as a threat to biodiversity and environment. It adopted light pollution guidelines. In very short words, they basically indicated the need for environmental impact assessment when we're talking about any lighting projects. And there is a specific color spectrum for different species and also direction downwards, like these are the main points of it. And they recommended the implementation of these guidelines to the members of the convention. However, the problem with this all work is, my apologies, is that it focuses specifically on the species protected under this convention. So there's way more species which can be impacted by light pollution, and it's also not binding documents. On the other hand, all the conventions in United Nations Environmental Program, they work together. So meaning that this may be followed up by convention on biological diversity, for example. And then they can adopt something what will be binding for the national states. So this is important work going on. And finally, I forgot to see how much time did I take. My conclusions and recommendations. So current regulatory framework on light pollution reduction, it's very diverse and very complex. This is why the classification was developed. It mainly focuses on energy efficiency, but we already can start to see the movements towards other impacts, for example, mainly actually environmental concerns. There is a big problem with implementation. As I mentioned earlier, there's not that many national states adopt defined competence who is gonna actually control the lighting and what can be the sanctions for it for non-compliance. There's no clear competence and no sanctions. What can be done? What I think is useful in this regard, it's more binding regulations at all levels, so starting from the local to the international. But the international, it takes way more time, so we have to act at the national level as fast as we can, and then facilitate the European Union, at least within the policy documents. Then this problem requires collaboration and joint action. This is why I'm very happy that we're having this workshop now. And also it's nice to see the professionals from different countries with different backgrounds come together. It's multi-actor involvement and engagement. Again, I want to highlight that we have to include more lighting industry into discussion. Light pollution should be legally recognized as an environmental problem and included in environmental protection framework. I'm talking here about the national states again at the national level. We should address all the impacts of that. We have to have sanctions. We have to have more awareness-raising debates by basically explaining to general public even what light pollution is and talk about the connectivity with dark skies and external environment. We have to have budget monitoring and measurements of light pollution, so we have to introduce more light pollution control. And then we have to have, this was highlighted in the manifesto which we drafted as well, the principle of openness and transparency of data on element sources. The current situation is that we basically don't know how many lights are there because local governments don't have, not all the local governments have an obligation to actually have kind of a database on the amount of lighting poles they have. So it's also very interesting. And I would like to summarize with my slogan, let's put it that way: stop spreading the light, start caring about the night. And thank you for your attention. And I'm looking forward for the questions and discussion.